and some of the preliminary findings that we will share with you. We don't have much time to engage in a full discussion as we had hoped, but we would have a few minutes to have some questions at the end before we conclude today. So I now ask my colleague Janet Looney to give the presentation.
So, good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us to this session.
It's behind you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I realize I'm the only thing standing between you and a concert from some charming young ladies and then your dinner. So we'll try and be efficient here. So you've had the introduction of what this is about. This follows on some other work that we were just listening to about, should I be holding this? Is that better? Okay. So this is related to other work that's ongoing on initial teacher education and mapping what's happening there. This is for the full spectrum of teacher careers. So, our methods for this study were based on three components. We did a review of the research and policy literature on issues related to teacher quality, teacher competences, teacher professionalism. I will tell you that most of the research was done in the English language literature, but we were able to round it out with the international literature, which is written in English and covers most countries. We also implemented a questionnaire. We designed the questionnaire based on previous work that had been done on teacher standards frameworks and also on the literature, and we sent it to the UNESCO offices and asked for experts who had been working in this area to give their feedback on how they had designed their own country or regional frameworks and what was in them. We focused both on the process because we wanted to know who had been involved, what kind of processes they used to consult with people, to pilot and confirm their professional standards, and also what was included in them. And based on these answers, we also did a mapping and comparative analysis, and those results are going to be in the final report. So just to let you know, I'm going to go briefly through the literature and spend more of the time on the results of the questionnaire, because I think most of the people here are pretty well versed in the background of teaching standards. So why create professional teaching standards? These are really fairly new developments talking about professional teaching standards. We know from the research, as many people have already said today, that teacher quality is the most important school level factor associated with student achievement. We can also add to that school leaders are the second most important factor. And as our Estonian colleague said this morning, without a good school leader, you really aren't going to be able to do much in any school. Students' assessments have been used a lot to measure teacher quality in recent years, but they are really only a proxy measure of teacher quality. We can't really get into what it is, what counts as a good teacher, or really get any detailed information that could be used for feedback from the student assessments. Also, when the test stakes are high, of course, as you know, that can lead to unintended consequences like teaching to the test and narrowing of teaching. When we get down to teaching standards, though, we're defining more clearly what teachers need to know and be able to do to support student learning, what teachers themselves need to know and learn and do at different stages of their career, and how they can advance. Another issue is that standards can be used to refine the SDG 4, so they have direct relevance to UNESCO work. So, among the literature, there are a number of issues that are related, are noted about what it takes to create effective teaching standards. So, in some way, they're a technocratic tool outlining indicators, but they're also outlining values, and they're outlining the priorities for education. They're drawing on the evidence of what constitutes a good teacher, and they're also recognizing the complexity of teaching, because there is no one best way to teach. That makes it really challenging to create a good framework that encompasses the most essential elements of being a good teacher, but is also flexible enough that it can be used in different contexts. So we have teachers with different personalities, we have different contexts, we have different students. All of these count. Also, we need to recognize that teaching is affected by the school environment. We just talked about school leadership. It's the school ethos, it's the levels of school teacher autonomy, how they can collaborate with their colleagues and peers, and so on. So when we're thinking about teacher effectiveness, we can't forget the school effectiveness aspect of it. I also want to mention that teacher policy is in a broader ecosystem, and it's very important to consider how teaching standards or competences are aligned with other aspects of the ecosystem. So we have, in the outer circle, the general context, the labor market, the social status and prestige of teachers, social welfare policies, and so on. We have education policy, which has all the different aspects of curriculum, governance, pedagogical cultures, innovation, and so on. And then we have teacher policy itself. And there are several instruments that are used to influence teacher policy. Teaching standards or competences are really transversal policies that affect all of these. So they can be used to improve the social status and prestige, to shape tools, teacher evaluation, how teachers collaborate, and so on. So it really is a key lever in affecting teacher quality. Just to outline it in words, the next slide. We can look at the different policies where it's used from the very beginning for accreditation of the initial teacher education programs themselves, what it takes for students to get into those programs, how high are the standards for entry, what are their academic qualifications, do we ask about their motivation at the teacher certification and registration entry point, their accreditation, how they proceed through their careers, their working conditions, accountability, is it more focused on improvement, on different aspects of accountability, their professional ethics, and their overall status. In fact, that's one of the major arguments we often hear about teaching standards, is it puts teaching on an equal footing with doctors, lawyers, and other professions where they have universal standards. So that was a very brief run through some of the groundwork for teaching standards, and I want to go into some of the highlights from the questionnaire that we implemented. So it was designed as an online consultation, and we asked UNESCO area offices to identify experts who had worked directly on the design of teaching standards to answer some questions about the processes and the actual content. They were from various types of agencies and universities. They had different positions, but they had to be closely involved. We had respondents from Asia Pacific, Arab-speaking countries, North Africa and the Middle East, and in sub-Saharan African countries. So we had quite a few, about 80 responses altogether, and about 40 countries responded to us. There's still opportunities for more input, so I'm going to be asking for that also. We also looked at other ongoing study because this is really an area where many people are interested and have been doing research. So we looked at work of the International Forum of Teaching and Regulatory Authorities in Scotland, and they gathered the standards themselves and did a comparison. And they had some coverage that also rounded out what we did from the United Kingdom and essentially all the Anglophone countries, the Middle East region, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So far, and I'm saying so far because there's still opportunities to work on the questionnaire, we had countries. This is sort of the distribution of what we've received so far. We would like to round it out so we have a little bit more balanced representation from different countries. And I'll invite you to, I'll be happy to send anyone the questionnaire who can help us complete that. Here I want to give an overview of the timeline. You can see that these are really fairly recent. This is just, I'm going through the next 3 slides very quickly. You can see that basically, aside from Uzbekistan, they started in 1997 and they've been updating. Most people have started in the some in the early 2000s, but most really in the mid to 2000s and more recently. So it really is a new phenomena. Some countries have some learning in the past that they would like to, they could share, and others are really getting new and up-to-date standards. In terms of the responses themselves, I would say that countries are taking a highly aspirational approach to the design of their professional teaching standards. At first, we were a little bit puzzled because when we got the results, everyone was checking all the boxes of the different competences that they wanted their teachers to have. But in fact, the results from the IFTRA confirmed that people are really, the countries are putting out many standards in their frameworks, setting those out as goals for their teachers. Many of them are the 21st century competences that we've been talking about all day in terms of critical thinking, transversal competences, and so on. We know from the discussion earlier this morning that even countries in the highest achieving ranks of the PISA examination are still working on getting to the 21st century competences. Countries are making investments in capacity building, which will be needed to meet these standards. But they've also noted that they're facing a lot of challenges, and this is across all income level countries. Teacher shortages, they may have low availability of quality of teacher training and professional development. Teacher salaries are very often non-competitive with other professions, and especially difficulty in recruiting teachers from remote areas. So if we're going to address these challenges and reach the goals of the standards, we're going to need some very well-designed long-term strategies. The next slide is interesting because it's really how these standards are being used. One of the interesting points, I think, is that there's a real focus on using the standards at the beginning of the teacher career for initial teacher education. So out of the 40 countries, 28 countries said that they were using it specifically for this. And in fact, some of the countries stop really at this point. That's where they're targeting, and they're not going on for career ladders. Many others do provide career ladders. Others are identifying continuing professional development needs. They're supporting reference standards for teacher self-appraisal, but they're not really looking at external appraisal. They're not very often used. The least frequently used is to support disciplinary processes. And we don't see any evidence that they're being used to decide how to sort teachers to different schools so that each school has a full complement of staff with levels of experience, types of expertise, and so on. So they also don't respond to the issue of the non-competitive salaries, but they do tend to set out career development opportunities, which can be considered as one kind of extrinsic incentive. The teacher self-appraisal is important, but there is not really a discussion in many of these about how to get feedback from external observers, supervisors, peers, and students. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen at all, but it's less frequent than I would have expected. So, we also asked how these are designed. On what basis are people designing their standards? So there are fairly serious approaches to looking at what competences teachers need in terms of their pedagogical knowledge. They may be looking at a set of guiding principles or content knowledge. And they're also looking at the attitudes and values, so they're not leaving it to just the pedagogical aspects, but also other aspects. Several countries say that they're looking at what other countries are doing. Peer learning is really something that people are thirsty for, it appears. And in terms of the process, there was a lot of stakeholder involvement. So most countries have included the stakeholders in their design process, the initial teacher education providers themselves, the teachers, the school leaders, so they're going to the source. Some people went even further and consulted with parents and other community leaders and so on. They used focus groups, stakeholder panels, advisory committees, surveys, so they were able to get a broad set of opinions as well as more focused, deeper input. In terms of the actual standards, here what I'm setting out our intention is to create a framework that is based on all the input. Right now I'm sharing with you a framework that was developed by IFTRA based on their analysis of the standards themselves. They said that consistently, they've developed this typology kind of as a synthesis, so they don't all look like this, but these are the elements that we tend to see and the domains we tend to see. So professional knowledge, practice, values, attitudes, and ethical conduct. And these are the main categories. I can say that in our own questionnaire that everything that is in there is also in ours and maybe a few others. But this is fairly consistent that people are designing ambitious and fairly extensive standards frameworks. Finally, we asked respondents if they felt that an international guidance framework would be useful, and they were positive about that. They felt that it would be useful to harmonize frameworks and that they would like to have some guiding principles. I think it's important that they noted that having an international guidance framework might raise the profile for their own national standards, because if they've been developed but they're not being used, that's not going to do much to change the quality of the teaching workforce. They're anxious for pure learning, and they feel that having common conceptual basis can promote understanding of teaching methods and facilitate research, I think, which is also very consistent with what we've heard in other parts of this conference. Some people hesitated a little bit. They felt that there was a need to have a very flexible framework so that it could allow for contextualization. That makes perfect sense. Finding the right balance will also take quite a lot of input from different stakeholders across countries. Finally, I just want to mention a few gaps that I observed and ask you about others that you might see. It seemed to me that there were a lot of focus on inward focus for schools. So they were talking about collaboration and innovation within the school, but not necessarily across schools. This is a recipe for 1,000 flowers blooming, but not necessarily for disseminating and sharing innovations and their impact further. I mentioned before that standards could be really important for teacher sorting. So what I mean by that is that when you have an idea of who has what competences, where they are in their career, levels of experience, you can have a full complement of staff assigned to different schools or attracted to different schools so that you have an equal quality of faculty in every school. It would also be important to have more specific standards or competence profiles for support for initial teacher education, teachers who are working in different settings. So for example, if you have a multiple age class, you might need some specific competences to deal with that if you're working in a remote area or something like that. Teachers who are working in emergency contexts, in increasingly diverse classrooms, in disadvantaged schools, etc. And finally, I want to say more communication strategies and efforts to influence attitudes about learning. This didn't come out a lot in the questionnaire, but I think it's probably more typical than people indicated that shifting mindsets to teach in new ways is not easy. This is one of the reasons probably why teachers are focusing mostly on initial teacher education, and they'll also need to focus on teacher educators. But this will need some careful thinking about influence strategies and dissemination and so on. So it's a very brief overview. It might be a little bit much to ask you to immediately give me a lot of information on gaps, but I'd like to say that we're very happy to hear from you as you have more time to see the report and so on about gaps that you might observe. We're also very interested in success stories, lessons learned, and anything else you'd like to share with us. So thank you. So, can I ask, who here has teaching standards that have been in place for a long time that they feel are working very well? Yeah? Do we have a mic to pass around? I can give you this one, and then you can ask questions.
I have, okay. Where? Just behind here. In that section? Oh.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I think this is really very interesting, and yeah, very interesting. And I think so what you presented, so some of which respond to some of the questions that colleagues raised in the previous session on teacher typology regarding the fact that we should not limit to only to teacher education, but rather to competencies. And so some element that you showed in the like accreditation and initial training, which are considered in the typology, should also be should feed in the competence. And I think we are looking forward to working together on having this integrated work between your work on the competency, teacher competencies, or standard, if you wish. I mean, there is a debate about how to call it, standards or competencies, and the typology. I think that this is great, and so there are a lot of complementarity between the two things. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Janet, for the presentation.
Go down?
Yeah. We don't have much time. We can take one or two questions if there are any. Otherwise, Janet will be here all week, and we are looking for more countries to present themselves, so we can have more case studies to include in the final report. So anyone who would like to share a country case study, please speak to myself or speak to Janet, and there was couldn't be done through an interview or a quick questionnaire. That would be super helpful. And the next steps in this project would be, like our colleague from UIS was saying, we are going to be collaborating with each other, but for the standards work, once the consultation with the countries for the comparative mapping is completed, we're hoping to then start to draft an international guiding framework for the professional teaching standards that we will then draft. We will have a draft that will be shared with countries for their consultation, for their feedback and input before we finalize the document. That would be our next steps. Questions? Yes? The microphone is...
Okay, Sonia.
Oh, you have it. Okay,
yeah,
please go ahead.
I have the microphone. Thank you very much. My name is Dennis Signolo from Education International, and thanks, Janet, for your presentation. Indeed, we did a study ourselves on professional teaching standards around the world, and have been working with our affiliates and governments actually in specific countries to develop these standards. But what we noticed from our research was that some countries that have standards, but the way they were developed, unfortunately, excluded teachers. So it's important to hear from you, Janet, to what extent those countries that have standards actually had teachers contributing or leading the development of those instruments. Bearing in mind that teaching is a profession, and in any profession, it is the professionals themselves that define their standards. It is the same thing in medicine. It is the same thing in law. So it's important that teachers are in the driver's seat, not in the passenger seat. So as EI, Education International, of course, we are working with UNESCO, and we look forward to having a robust framework which is informed by, of course, what is happening around the world, but most importantly, the aspirations of the women and men who are in our classrooms.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thank you to the presenter. I was just thinking through the title of the whole project, because I'm referring to the purposes of teaching standards, which are, let's say, defined as transversal to serve the purpose of accreditation, certification, career development, CPD, and all the rest. And then I was wondering whether the framework should not target the teacher as such and not the teaching. You see. That's something I think we should discuss at some time at the point. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that comment. It's quite, I think this was an internal debate with whether it should be standards for teachers or standards for teaching. So this will be something we will have to continue working on, as well as whether we're developing standards or competency profiles. It will be up to teachers, the profession. The goal is to, when we have our consultations with national representatives or regional representatives, the goal is to make those the teachers. They will be the ones who will be giving us the input of what this is ultimately going to be looking like at the end, and we will hope to address those questions by having the professionals decide. Yes, one more question? Yes.
Oui, merci, madame. Thank you very much, madam. I'm really asking myself the following question. When the standards have been developed by the teachers, whether they be the teachers of tertiary level or secondary level or primary education or preschool education, they're still teachers? Or do we want these standards to be developed by unions or by other people at the National Assembly level? Even within the National Assembly, when laws are voted on and adopted, it is always commissions that are very often made up of teachers. So I cannot understand then when we say that the standards were developed by non-teachers. It's as if you're telling me that when we have to operate on somebody else is going to operate, not the doctors or the surgeons who should be doing the operation, but even surgeons are doctors. So these are people who know exactly what is to be done. In the case of Mali, for example, we do have standards, and all of the tests that have been made and developed were developed on the basis of the real situation on the ground. Today, for example, in the teaching profession, we have a new curriculum which is fully aligned with basic education curriculum. That is, in the basic education curriculum, it is the teacher who teaches the students, those students who are going, the student teachers who are going to teach basic education classes. So having done this, we have developed, and in this standards and in this setting of standards for the curriculum, we do have teachers from the tertiary level, we have inspectors, we have teachers who teach in the teacher training institutions. We also have principals of schools, well-established schools, who know exactly the sort of pedagogy which we need. So I do not understand what we mean when you talk about standards outside of the teachers. It is always the teachers who are involved in the standards setting. So perhaps we have to be more specific, whether should it be groups of unions or unionists. But even the unionists are actually teachers. So I think that we must really encapsulate and situate the problem. We know it's true that we do have difficulties, but every day we try to more and more to rectify the situation. For example, in Mali, we have a number of projects to bring about professionalization of teachers. We have had some difficulty with restructuring and with all of that. But today in Mali, we have 19 teacher training institutions that are functional, and the teachers are often recruited following these indicators. In other words, they must have a diploma to be recruited, or at least they have to sit an examination first and foremost to become teachers. They do this with a certificate for 4 years, or they do the competition with the baccalaureate for 2 years, a 2-year baccalaureate. They have to sit an examination to be teachers. So we are making some efforts, and we want to ensure that we have massive recruitment of teachers. But we have to ensure that these teachers really want to be teachers. We no longer recruit people who are not teachers. At least the government does not recruit people. Of course, private people may do something different. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I think we're in agreement. The framework is being developed. The background research is being undertaken by UNESCO and our partners, and the framework is going to be validated by the teachers themselves. It will be the teachers who will feed into identifying what the final framework will look like, whether they are teachers, whether they're in a union or independent of a union. It will be the classroom teachers who are working every day in classrooms who will be feeding into what this final framework will look like. I think we have to cut right now to let the children back in. Like I said, thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to giving you progress on this project as it moves along.